Look around you for a moment. What do you see? A chair? A table? A tree outside your window? Maybe another person? Reality seems neatly divided into separate things. We rarely question that. Why would we? It's one of the first things we ever learn. There's me, there's you, and then there's everything else. The world seems to arrive already sorted into individual objects. But today I like to ask a strange question. How do we actually know where one thing ends and another begins? And at first that sounds almost ridiculous. After all, we use words like object all the time. A chair, a cloud, a mountain, a human being. They all seem perfectly obvious. Until you try to explain what they actually are. Because something strange happened when I start looking for a physical definition of an object. I personally couldn't find one. Physics doesn't really talk about chairs or trees or people. It talks about particles, fields, energy, forces and interactions. Somewhere between the equations and my own experience, the object appears. Of course we all know that. Nobody believes the universe contains little labels saying chair or dog. These are our categories, of course. Ways of organizing reality, not reality itself. And that's perfectly fine. Without them, navigating the world would be almost impossible. But then I noticed something I couldn't unsee. Imagine you are looking at a cloud. At first, that seems like an obvious object. You point at it, you name it, you watch it drift across the sky. But then someone asks a surprisingly simple question. Where exactly does the cloud end? The keyword is exactly. That doesn't mean approximately. So at which molecule of water does the cloud stop and the atmosphere begin? There doesn't seem to be a physical answer. The cloud gradually becomes thinner, its droplets spread farther apart, until at some point calling it a cloud simply stops being useful. Nature never announced the boundary. We did. Now compare that to a rock. It certainly feels different from a cloud. Solid, stable, clearly separated from its surroundings. But what exactly makes the difference physical? Inside the rock, the atoms never touch. Most of it is empty space. Instead, they form an intricate network of interactions. Strong interactions and stable interactions. But interactions, nonetheless. Now strike the rock with a hammer. The crystal structure changes. Chemical bonds break, new surfaces appear, stresses redistribute. The physics change dramatically. But something curious never happens. Nowhere does nature suddenly declare there is now one more object. The equations describe changing forces, changing fields, changing energy, changing configurations. But they never introduce a variable called object. Somewhere between those changing interactions and the way I naturally describe them, one rock quietly becomes two. Not because physics see it that way, but because it is very useful for me. So I found myself asking a different question. Not when did one rock become two, but how weak does an interaction have to become before I stop treating it as one object? Physics never draws that line. We do. So something occurred to me. Why don't I naturally group together a lampshade in Texas and a pair of flip-flops in Recklinghausen, Germany? They interact. Weakly, but they do. So does everything else. The difference isn't that one interaction exists and the other doesn't. The difference is that one pattern is useful for me to recognize while the other isn't. Somewhere along the way my brain learned where to draw boundaries. And ever since I noticed that, I haven't been able to unsee it. I can define anything as a system. but I can't see anything as a system. Solely visually, I see objects, even though I know better. Then I realize something even stranger. The same thing happens when I look at myself. I perceive myself. I don't feel like a useful pattern. I feel like one individual. I feel like one perspective, one continuous existence. I feel like me. If objects are only models, why don't my own existence feel like one? Where exactly does this sense of being a separate individual come from? Physics never points to a line and says, "Here begins you." It simply describes another unimaginably complicated web of interactions. And yet, I experience being myself. Not because I decide to, but because I can't help it. That seems difficult to ignore. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Perhaps we shouldn't be asking which objects are conscious. Perhaps we should first ask why we see objects at all. Because if rocks, trees, dogs and people are all simply different regions of one continuous physical reality, then perhaps what really distinguishes them isn't what they are, but which patterns they manage to sustain. Not different substances, different dynamics, different forms of organization. Some remain stable for milliseconds, some for millions of years. Some regulate only a handful of variables. Others regulate billions simultaneously. Maybe that's the distinction we've been looking for. Not between living and non-living, not between object and organism, not between conscious and unconscious, but between different kinds of stable dynamics. And if that's true, then perhaps conscious was never a property of an object in the first place. We only ever see different organizations, different timescales, different degrees of stability, different patterns, but always dynamics. So why should consciousness suddenly be something completely different? Why should it be the only thing in nature that isn't itself part of that picture? Perhaps consciousness was never a property attached to certain arrangements of matter. Couldn't it be a dynamical property of the universe itself? Auf Wiedersehen.